lecture today, right now. Okay, so we, if you look on the syllabus, we have the urinary system, reproductive, and development, right? We are right now, so today I'm going to talk about the urinary system. I finish up with the urinary system next week and start on male reproductive system, female reproductive system. December um, December 3rd, we will talk about human development. A little bit about human development, not too much. And your exam 4 will be on December 17th. Okay. And even though there's 3-hour lecture, we just gonna take like an hour or so for the exam, and then there's nothing after that. And we can start, I think start at 6:15 is good. Okay. All right. So let me stop the recording here. Yeah. The next thing we're going to talk about the urinary system, and the urinary system function. I'm going to talk about it function. It has many function. For those who have me for lab last week, I told them there are numerous functions of the urinary system, particularly the way that you remember it is okay. So here are the functions of the urinary system. How particularly the urinary system has the 2 kidneys. Typically, the right kidney is lower. That's a bad, ugly kidney. Here's another kidney. Okay. The right kidney is a little lower than the left kidney. Is because of the liver. The ureter, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. Okay. And the bulk of the function of the urinary system is performed by the kidney. You see here, the kidney, and the ureter is just a conduit for urine to flow from the kidney, and then it stores here, which is the urinary bladder. And then at appropriate time, the urine leaves the body via urethra. Okay. But the kidney, one of the functions of the kidney is to filter your blood. By filter, I mean it remove the waste from your body. But it only can do so if there is sufficient hydrostatic pressure. If the hydrostatic pressure is low, it would not be able to filter the blood. And so the kidney in the long term can regulate your blood, right? And it does through several ways. One is to secrete EPO, for example, right? And remember EPO, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin will stimulate the hematopoietic stem cell to undergo erythropoiesis, which is the development of red blood cell. So high EPO, high red blood cell, for example. But we saw the effect of aldosterone. Right? Aldosterone is being released from the adrenal cortex, and it will stimulate the kidney to take back sodium. And when the kidney takes back sodium, water will usually follow. An attempt to increases the blood volume, increases the blood, increases the blood pressure. We also saw that the posterior pituitary put out ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormones stimulate the renal tubule to take back water. And hyposecretions of ADH, in which you don't have produce enough ADH, and you're going to avoid a lot. You're going to develop condition known as diabetes insipidus, right? And so it regulates water through ADH. And then finally, the heart atria, if the pressure is very high, it can release ANP. ANP stands for natriuretic peptide, and this is the opposite of aldosterone. It actually stimulates the kidney to get rid of the sodium. Okay? And if the kidney get rid of sodium, water will follow, and blood volume will decrease. And that's only released when your blood pressure is very high. You may or may not know this, but another function of the kidney is involved in activations involved in the activations of vitamin D. Okay. And vitamin D, the basis of vitamin D is cholesterol. And it's typically the precursor of vitamin D is usually goes to the skin where the UV light activates it, so it becomes pro-vitamin D. The liver modifies it to calcitriol, and the kidney further modifies it to calcidiol, which then vitamin D together with PTH stimulates the small intestine to take back calcium. So if you just take calcium but you don't take vitamin D, you won't get absorption of calcium to the small intestine. Another function of the kidney that is involved in what we consider as glucogenesis. Now, we saw under anaerobic respiration, pyruvate can genesis. We saw that pyruvate can convert it to lactic acid under anaerobic respiration, and in doing so that it could oxidize the NADH to NAD positive, and NAD positive is needed for gluconeogenesis. For glycolysis. But if you have too much of NADH, then normally NADH is converted to NAD positive if there is oxygen, so that NADH can convert it to NAD positive if it's give its electron as part of the electron transport change. Well, regardless, pyruvate is converted to lactic acid during anaerobic respiration. And in the liver, the lactic acid is converted back to pyruvate, which can be used to make glucose, and glucose can actually export it out of the hepatocyte, which get into the blood, and from the blood, the skeletal muscle can use it. And so that's just part of the Cori cycle that you know, right? But if someone who is starving and doesn't have any carbon source, no glucose, your body will, first thing will do is break down glycogen, which is a storage of glucose, if you will. If you use up the glycogen, you're trying to break down fat as part of the beta oxidation. Part of that breaks down of fat is often seen in diabetic mellitus, for example. And so they generate things like ketone body, And ketone bodies are a pretty acidic molecule that essentially is under a diabetic patient might develop acidosis. In this case, it will be metabolic acidosis, if you will. So if you break down glycogen first, then you break down fat, and if you do all that, so and you still don't have enough glucose, especially who's fasting for weeks or so, then the kidney, I mean, the body has to resort to breaks down of protein. So if you take protein, you break it down to its component with amino acid. Okay, and amino acid, every amino acid will have the functional carbonyl group, the acid, and the NADH, the amine group. You see here. This is the So this is a typical 20 amino acid will have two components, right? The acid part here and the amine group. If you're going to use the amino acid as a carbon source, the first thing you have to do is you have to remove this NH3, the amine group, or that become ammonia. And ammonia can be protonated to become ammonium. And these are very toxic molecules in the body. And the liver is, in fact, will convert these to urea. But the deaminations of amino acids, so in general, you could say is that if you have a lot of protein turnover, you will get a lot of ammonia and ammonium, which then become a urea, which is one of the nitrogenous wastes in the kidney. But from this breakdown of remove this amine group, like glutamine, if you ever see that, remove the amine group, it become alpha ketoglutarate. But anyway, the carbon source that you break down from amino acid can be used to make glucose as part of gluconeogenesis. And the kidney is involved in making glucose from amino acid, right? Kidney cannot make glucose from carbon dioxide and water and UV light. Only plant can do that. The kidney or our body make glucose from some other carbon source first. Okay. And I mentioned to you earlier that ammonia, as part of the liver urea cycle, it can take molecule like carbon dioxide and it will link that to ammonia and another ammonia. So it's a way to get rid of the ammonia and carbon dioxide. This molecule is known as the urea. Okay, it's part of the urea cycle if you want to read it up. And this is also has to be eliminated from our body. And that's exactly what the kidney does, is that it can eliminate this whole bunch of waste that has nitrogen in them. So we call it eliminate nitrogenous waste. Not only ammonia, ammonium, urea, creatinine, which is come from degradations of creatine phosphate in the skeletal muscle, uric acid come from degrading nucleotide. Another important thing what the kidney does is that if you ever, when you guys take medications like antibiotics, and pharmacists might tell you, hey, you take this drug every 6 hours. And so why? It's because our kidney is detoxifying that drug from the blood, detoxification. And detoxification is the kidney has a great way to excrete this compound from your body so that pharmacologically, if you take 100 milligram of some drug, 6 hours later, you know, you might not see it in your body, and then you take it again so that you want to maintain high level of this drug, but the kidney will excrete that medication, and sometimes um, it's very true with people who have acute renal failure. Acute renal failure is because people who might be got injection of a contrast dye to see the blood vessel, for example. That contrast dye is part of the blood, and the kidney is removing that. And when we remove those contrast dye, where does it store? It stores in the urinary bladder, right? But the chemical substance itself might be toxic to the renal tubule. Um, and so this whole, the whole bunch of class of these medication that the kidney get rid of end up being toxic. So we call that nephrotoxic, and it can kill the renal tubule, and thus you can have acute renal failure, for example. So detoxification, and I mentioned already under the influence of aldosterone, um, it can regulate sodium. And sodium and potassium is the yin and the yang. In fact, when someone who has, um, say, destruction of the red blood cell, if you destroy the red blood cell, then intracellularly there's a lot of potassium that can leak, right? It can leak out. So we call that hyperkalemia. And in fact, it is the adrenal cortex that's sensing how much potassium it is. If you have condition known as hyperkalemia, homeostatic mechanism is to get rid of potassium. But in the kidney, if you get rid of potassium, you take back sodium, right? And so the aldosterone, we think yes, it does stimulate the kidney to take back sodium. But on the other hand, when it takes back sodium, it gets rid of potassium. You see, so that's the yin and the yang. As part of the respiratory system, we see that someone who developed, metabolic acidosis, the respiratory system can get rid of that hydrogen ion by coupled with the bicarbonate. And the bicarbonate system, particularly inside the red blood cell, right? Bicarbonate plus hydrogen ions become carbonic acid, which can be breakdowns to the water and carbon dioxide. And as part of the external respiration, carbon dioxide then can be expelled out of the body. Okay? And so indirectly, the respiratory system can regulate the blood pH through the bicarbonate system. But if someone who has respiratory acidosis, like say respiratory depression, someone is choking and they can't expel out the CO2, you can have respiratory acidosis, and it's the kidney, and the kidney is the only system that can control the pH in your body by get rid of, excrete out hydrogen ions directly. Okay. All right, so put them all together. What are the functions of the kidney? Big, des, C. Okay, blood involved in gluconeogenesis, detoxification, elimination, sodium, potassium, and control of pH. So those are the function of the urinary system, or particularly the kidney. Now, we're going to see that in the future, if I ask you what's the functional unit of the kidney, okay, and the functional unit of the kidney is known as the nephron. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. So we're going to spend some time talking about this nephron. Just like in the skeletal muscle system, you say, oh, what is the functional unit of the skeletal muscle? That's a sarcomere. What is a functional unit of bone? It's the osteon. Functional units of hearing in the ear is the organs of Corti. Okay, so here's the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. And the nephron function is really to do all of that, but ultimately what it's going to do is going to make urine. And in the urine, you have your waste, you have very different levels of sodium, depends on the body need. Your urine also will have, different levels of water, depends on the status of the body, and so forth. And urine formation involved in these 3 steps. Okay, what are the 3 steps? 1, glomeric filtration. 2, tubular absorption. And 3, known as tubular secretion. So your medication, for example, is secreted through this process. And to understand, I have to show a little bit about anatomy. And the way what the kidney does is that it filters your blood first, right? And so it might give up the glucose, which is part of the blood first, but then it filter and then it takes back again and say, hey, I don't want to get rid of you. I'll take it back again. And so that's what we mean by tubular reabsorption. But definitely things that cannot be filtered are, proteins, red blood cell, white blood cell, platelets. All that is too big to pass through the filtration membrane, which is very similar to respiratory membrane. You recall respiratory membrane, the basement membrane, and the inner of the blood vessel. Similarly, the filtration membrane here in the kidney composed of instead of an alveolar cell, there's a special cell called podiocyte, which is part of the visceral layers of the Bowman's capsule. If you don't know what that is, I'll tell you in a little bit. Basement membrane and the endothelial cells of the blood vessel. So very, very, very similar. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the tests that people often use to gauge the kidney function. And kidney function, if both kidneys are working, an individual should make about 180 liter of filtrate. But you don't filter, you don't void 180 liter. You only, remove about 2 liter. So most of the filtrate that the kidney made, is reabsorbed, it takes back into the body, and it only excrete, percent, for example. And then we're going to talk about where our urine stores and how it's removed, and a little bit about the maturation reflex, which is a autonomic nervous system that is sensing how much urine is in the urinary bladder, while it is autonomic, but we can somewhat control through learning of some sphincters that you can control so that you don't go to the bathroom in the class, for example, but you void it in at in the bathroom. Okay, so the urinary system composed of two kidney, the ureters and the urethra. Um, and this is a female urethra. And female urethra tend to be shorter than the male urethra. So female tends to get easy get the urethra will get infection. And if the infection can go all the way up, they could develop pelvic inflammatory disease in female. And most of the time, it's easy to get infection. And the urinary tract infection, most of the time, is E. coli. And E. coli come from the normal flora, which is fecal material. And so if you clean, you always have to clean from front to back. You don't want to clean from back because you bring in E. coli bacteria from the anal cavity up, and that's where you may have infection. Location-wise, the anatomy of the kidney, while the small intestine and the large intestine, it sits in the peritoneum, which is a double layer of the which actually the mesentery, which is double layers of the peritoneum. Okay, and so you can see here, if you look at the jejunum, which is the middle portions of the small intestine, the colon, this right here is peritoneum. And you can see here, there's two layers of the peritoneum surrounding it. And if you just kind of imagine it go up this way, that's the mesentery. Okay, so then the superior mesenteric artery brings blood into the small intestine, for example. But oftentimes it's described that the kidney, it sits behind the peritoneum. So we call, here's the spine of L1 cord, or the L1 vertebra. And the kidney sits behind the peritoneum, or also known as the retroperitoneal cavity, right? Which is basically right about here, around L2 is the very beginning. And so what does that mean? That means it's very easy accessible. It's not like, your small intestine. If you're going to cut through the small intestine, you got to go through this layers of peritoneum, another layers of peritoneum to get to it. But here, all you have to do, you just make a slit here and you can get into the kidney, right? And so, guys, you have to beware, because if you go to a bar and some girls buy you a drink and you wake up the next day in a tub, right, soak in some ice, and find out that there might be a slit here, so you just remove your kidney.
Watch too many scary movies, man.
I think that's more like an urban legend, but it is true. It's easy accessible. In fact, people who have polycystic kidney disease is a genetic disorder that they develop a lot of cysts in the kidney, and whenever the cysts develop and it's popped, it's going to damage the nephron. And progressively, usually like in the early 20, they have no urine output, and that's like end stage renal failure, we call that. Then you have to go to dialysis to dilate your blood. But if you're really lucky enough, you can find someone who can give you kidney. And that is the case. The donor, they used to cut through them and get to the kidney. Now they can do it laparoscopically, especially 3 holes. One incision to put in the scissor, the other incision have a pouch, and the other one with the camera. Boom, cut it, bag it, pull it out, and a person can recover in 2 weeks or something. And while you have two kidneys, you can certainly live with one kidney, but you have to your two kidney. Most of the medication it's calculated with people with two kidneys. So if they say take 100 milligrams of that, doesn't assume that you have two kidneys. If you have one kidney, 100 milligrams of that medication may be too much, may be toxic. The kidney does not excrete that fast of a rate, and so you might have kidney failure because it's overworking. Um, so typically there are several layers that surround the kidney, and there's a membrane called renal fascia, which is help it sits in place, and under the renal fascia, adipose tissue, which is this second layer, and then you have the capsule, which is the third layer. So those are 3 layers that help it sits in place. A lot of fat, kind of acting like insulator, and cushions it. So someone who punched there, you might have a little bit of protections there. Okay. And I kind of summarize for you with the functions already. Filter your blood plasma, eliminate waste. Okay. Return useful substance back to the. This is reabsorption, and I want to explain to you how the kidney filters small particle first from the blood, and then it picks it back up again, like glucose, and ammonia or bicarbonate. Regulate blood volume and blood pressure. Obviously, pressure depends on volume. So if you increase blood volume, you increase pressure. If you decrease blood volume, you decrease blood pressure. But there are other factors that regulate pressure as well. Things like blood viscosity, for resistance, heart rate, and stroke volume. And regulate osmolarity. This basically all the salt concentrations. Wherever sodium is, chloride goes. It might regulate a little bit potassium, calcium too, under the influence of PTH. Parathyroid hormone can stimulate the kidney to take back calcium, to increase its blood calcium level, or the opposite under the influence of calcitonin, which is part of the hormone released by the thyroid gland or parafollicular cell. The kidney does release renin, and renin is the first enzyme that converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2 via ACE. And once you have angiotensin 2, which is, you can say, is downstream of the effect of renin, then aldosterone is released. Angiotensin is a vasoconstrictor, but it also stimulates the adrenal cortex to put out aldosterone, and in doing so, regulate sodium and regulate blood volume and regulate blood pressure. Secrete EPO, we talk about regulate acid and base. Um, it the kidney in the renal tubule, I'm going to show you maybe next week. There are 2 kinds of cells. There's alpha cells and the beta cell. Easy to remember, the alpha cell release the acid, where the beta cell release the base. So A for acid, B for base. Detoxify or free radical, we call that, and involving gluconeogenesis. So think of those as big desk C. Okay. Now here are some of the nitrogenous waste that must be eliminated from our body, and the kidney is a great, you know, um, kidneys, is a great organ to remove these. Uh, Remove urea. Where do you get urea from? Well, degradation of protein will give you urea. Protein is degraded into amino acid that has to be, we call it deamination, which means we remove this ammonia. And ammonia can form ammonium. The liver convert that to urea as part of the urea cycle. I don't have time to talk about the liver and the urea cycle. So here's what urea looks like. You can see that here's carbon dioxide, here's ammonia and ammonia. Uric acid, you can see how this looks like the base, nitrogenous base of nucleotide. And so typically every nucleic acid will have a base. In this case, we call this purine base, a ribose group like this. Right? And the difference between RNA and DNA is that this second carbon. This is the first carbon, carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5, and carbon 5 is linked to the phosphate, and so forth. But you can see that if you degrade this nucleotide, you get uric acid, and that has to be eliminated from our body. In some people, the uric acid can accumulate in the joint and it'd be very painful. Of course, the condition is known as gout. And the uric acid formation from catabolism and breakdown of nucleic acid. Creatine, uh, creatinine actually come from creatine phosphate, which is in the skeletal muscle a lot. The creatine phosphate is a fast way for the generate ATP. Remember, we have creatine phosphate convert to creatine, and in the process, uh, ADP is converted to ATP, and ATP needed for skeletal muscle contraction 3 ways. Remember that for detachment of myosin from actin, hydrolysis, recocking, and ATP may need it to transport calcium back to sarcoplasmic reticulum. All right, very important to note these two terms, okay? When your kidney is not working properly, the first thing that you see is these nitrogenous compound will increase. And so the term for it to increase is known as the BUN. Okay, BUN stands for blood urea nitrogen, and your BUN levels high suggested that you might have some kidney problem. Okay, the in this case we call this as azotemia. An azotemia patient might have increases BUN, and they haven't shown any kinds of signs and symptom yet. No sign and symptom. All you have to now is known as that the BUN increase. So it suggests that there's kidney not doing its job, okay? Or only do half of its job, only do a quarter of its job to get rid of these compounds from the body. And if you can't, right, if you have both kidney failure, this thing's going to accumulate in your body, and then you'll feel tired, physically tired, right? Fatigue, you can't think, and over time, azotemia will develop into uremia. And uremia when you start seeing sign and symptom. And that's when the body's trying to get rid of it through other way, not through the urinary system, but through the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. So you person might be, go up, meaning throw up, for example, in an attempt to get rid of that. Or they might go down, which is basically get, diarrhea. Or it might go outward. So in other words, profuse sweating. So those are the three signs that you often see that people develop uremia: vomiting, diarrhea, and profuse sweating. Right? In the body attempt to remove that waste. Uh, all right, so a little bit about excretion. We talked about already. The respiratory system can, normally get rid of CO2, but if CO2 come from bicarbonate, and bicarbonate can certainly link to hydrogen ion, so indirectly the respiratory system can get rid of the hydrogen ion. The integument system can remove definitely lactic acid, so but to some extent urea. Okay, it cannot remove uric acid, but urea, part of the nitrogenous compound. Digestive system, get rid of all these things: lipid biles or biles pigment, biles, which is actually has biliverdin and bilirubin, okay, which is come from degradations of red blood cells. Um, Urinary system then, get rid of these metabolic waste. And metabolic waste is different from your undigested waste. Right? If you eat a lot of salad, and salad doesn't not really nutritious because you don't get glucose, you don't get a lot of glucose or protein out of it. But if it's good anything, it's because it provides rugae, which is basically fibers. So it helps with your GI tract. But that we consider as undigested waste. That's not what we're talking about. And those undigested waste is only finds in the GI tract. But metabolic waste is found throughout our body. And then the kidney for the urinary system eliminate that. Toxin, excretion, drugs, also hormone, definitely a target for a lot of hormone. Hormone can be excreted, and then salt and water. All right, I think I'm just gonna go for another 15 minutes or so, and then instead of have a break, we just, I think we can end it there, and then we'll pick it up next week. Okay, so anatomy, the kidney is usually about the size of a bar of soap, about 160 grams. You can see that sits in the retroperitoneal cavity at a level of T12 to, vertebrae to third lumbar. And we already know it has the concave surface. This is concave because it looks like a cave, and this is a convex. Okay, and every kidney in real person, in real, if you just remove it, you will see there's a capsule. Okay, surrounding it. Under the capsule, there's a lot of blood vessel. There's a capsule. Okay. Some of the model might not shows the capsule, but there's a capsule there. And connective tissue covering it. We also saw the three layers: the renal fascia, the adipose, and the renal capsule. Okay, here is the drawing of the kidney. I want you to note that this regions here, all of this, is known as the renal cortex. And in the regions here is known as the medulla, the renal medulla. So the cortex is on the outside and the medulla is on the inside. Okay? Now, the medulla have divided, the medulla is that in fact it's divided so that you can see there are different lobes. So here's one lobe, if you will. Okay. One lobe. Here's another lobe. Here's another lobe. Okay. Now this right here that looks like a triangle, well in 3D it will be like this. Okay. And that's what we call that the renal pyramid. It's the pyramid. And of course you cut it one section, it looks like that. But it's a pyramid. At the tip of the pyramid is the nipple, we call that, or the renal papillae. Okay, renal papillae is at the tip. Between the two pyramids, this right here is known as the renal column. Right here. This is the renal column. Renal column here. Here it says renal column. Okay, so that's renal column. This right here is a renal pyramid. It is pointing to that. It's really this whole thing is a renal pyramid. Capsule sits on the outside. This right here that receives the urine from the renal papillae is known as the minor calyx. Minor calyx. You see there, that's a minor calyx. When you have a minor calyx, a minor calyx, a minor calyx, right? Or minor calyxes will merge to become major calyx. Major calyx. And at the pelvic, which is, like a pelvic, this part here is known as the renal pelvis, and then you have your ureter. So then again, this is just anatomy. You might see this again in the lab. I do want to mention to you if we're going to look at renal physiology, and that is the pyramid has the base, if you will, this right here, sits next to the cortex. And then it also has a region at the tip, okay, which is the papillae. Now, if you measure the concentrations of salt here versus here, the region that is near the cortex have roughly about 200 milliosmolarity. Okay, so that's just some value of salt there. But if you go deeper, right, into the medulla, it actually increases to 6 times to 1200 milliosmolarity. So my point here is that as you go deeper into the medulla, the salt concentration is higher. And the question is, what structure in making this salinity gradient? Okay, we call that salinity gradient. Salinity gradient. What structure involved in making it? And what is the purpose of the salinity gradient, right? And so if you imagine that, let's say this is 200 milliosmolarity and of salt concentration, and this is 1200 milliosmolarity of salt concentration. So let's say there's a tube here, and this tube is permeable to water, right? That means water can come out, permeable to water. So you can see that as the more salt that you have, the greater ability for it to absorb the water. You see that? And so whatever this stuff inside this tube is, let's say filtrate, the filtrate is the fluid in this tube, for example. If it's losing the fluid because there's so much salt around it, then the filtrate then could become very concentrated down here. Okay. But if this is urine, right, then, the kidney having this salinity gradient can take back a lot of fluid from the urine. Um, and so, in fact, there are a lot of tubes that go through this uh, medulla, and that is known as the collecting duct. The collecting duct carry urine. The collecting duct, by the way, is not part of the nephron, but they're collecting urine, uh, and all the collecting duct seems to point toward the renal papillae. In fact, they bring urine toward that way. But as you can see that it goes to the medulla. And so if that's the case, there's potential for water to be taken back from the collecting duct. And if that's the case, then you create a very concentrated urine. All right. All right. Lobes. So you can see how this is one lobe of the kidney. Here's a nice divider of the cortex relative to the medulla. Okay, so all this thing right here, this one is collecting duct, right? And collecting duct might be up here and they merge into papillary duct, but it's the same thing. It's collecting duct. And you can see it empty into the renal papillae, who's then drain it into the minor calyx. You can see here. Okay. Um, this structure right here is a nephron. This structure here is a nephron. This structure is a nephron, right? You have different kinds of nephron. This nephron that is near the medulla, this one near the medulla, we call this a juxtamedullary nephron. Juxta, the words juxta mean opposed or next to. Juxtamedullary nephron. Where the nephron up here, you see this one? This is known as the cortical nephron. And I will point out for you later on what are some of the differences between the juxtamedullary nephron, right, which is this one right here. This is the juxtamedullary nephron versus this one right here is cortical nephron. All right, so what are the components of the nephron? Okay, nephrons, we're going to see components of nephrons are, one, the Bowman's capsule. Two, proximal convoluted tubule. Tubule. Three, loops of Henle. And four, distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so these are the four components. And you can see there's this thing right here, sort of look like a C. That's the Bowman's capsule. This little thing here is convoluted, that looks near the letter C. That's distal convoluted tubule. This right here is a loops of Henle, loops of Henle, loops of Henle, and loops of Henle. Okay, and then if you follow through, there is a portion that is very far from the Bowman's capsule. This one right here is called distal convoluted tubule. So the distal convoluted tubule then connected to the collecting duct, and collecting duct is not part of the nephron. Okay. Usually what you see is that there's a fluid that flows in the Bowman's capsule to the proximal convoluted tubule, to the loop assembly, to the distal convoluted tubule. That liquid is known as filtrate. It's the product of filtration, known as the filtrate. But once the filtrate reaches the collecting duct here, then it can be known as urine. But if it's not in the collecting duct and it's still in these right here, it's the filtrate. All right, so this is the gross anatomy of the kidney. We might have similar. You guys should take advantage of APR, Anatomy and Physiology Review, as part of the Connect. I know I'm testing my student on Connect, and they will see images like this. Again, the cortex is out here, renal cortex. You have the renal medulla, renal pelvis, that's nice and easy, ureter. We're going to see later on that between these two blood vessels, if it's bigger and thinner, is renal vein. If it's thicker and smaller, it's renal artery, bring blood in. You can start seeing the papillae here, renal papillae. This is the lobe, if you will. And you can start seeing here's the minor calyx to major calyx. Alrighty. So the first part of the nephron is this part right here is known as the Bowman's capsule. Okay. Now the Bowman's capsule have two layers. You have this layers here. It's known as the visceral layer, and the visceral layer is composed of these cells known as podocyte. The wall of a capillary is known as glomerulus. Okay. So typically, for the kidney to filter blood, you have a structure here, okay, which we call it a glomerulus. Okay, now there's the blood vessel that brings blood into this ball of capillary or knot of capillary. It's known as glomerulus. And there's a blood vessel that brings blood out. Okay? The blood vessel that brings the blood into the glomerulus is known as the afferent arteriole, or afferent arteriole. And the blood vessel that brings blood out of the glomerulus here, and it typically is smaller, right? This is known as the efferent or the efferent arteriole. And what you can see is that the Bowman's capsule has two layers. It has this inner layer here, it's known as the visceral layer, and then it has this layer right here. It's called the parietal layer. Of Bowman's capsule, and this is the visceral layer. Okay, now blood is actually filtered through this. Okay, and this right here is that filtration membrane. The capillary has an endothelial layer, right? So just like filtration membrane in the, just like the respiratory membrane, you have the endothelial layers of the blood vessel, okay? Endothelial layer of the blood vessel. You have the basement membrane, and then you have your, in this case, in the respiratory membrane, you would say it's a type 1 alveolar cell, but here it would be the visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule. The visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule, by the way, has these cells that look like um, um, foot process, also known as podocyte. Okay? Podocyte. Podocytes are cells that forms as the visceral layers of the Bowman's capsule. There is a space here, it's known as the capsular space, if you will, capsular space, and it's the capsular space that is, receive the uh, fluid. That fluid is known as filtrate. Filtrate. And red blood cell, white blood cell, all that proteins are still in here. They're too big. They don't leave. They become part of the blood. White blood cell, red blood cell. They're too big to pass through, and then all of that can go into here. In the efferent arteriole, and later on I'll tell you that the efferent arteriole will give rise to peritubular capillary. But in this case, the Bowman's capsule, then it goes into this network. I'm not going to do it justice, but that's considered a proximal convoluted tubule. Okay. And then it goes down into this loops of Henle, and do it again into the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting duct. So your job also to do is to trace the filtrate flow. Filtrate flow starting from the Bowman's capsule to the proximal convoluted tubule, to the loops of Henle, to the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. So that's the filtrate flow. Here, Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, which I can also now use PCT for proximal convoluted tubule, 3 loops of Henle, and 4 DCT for distal convoluted tubule. LOH2. What do you guys use? LOL, left out loud. This is LOH for left out hilarious. For loops of Henle. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, let's let me do a couple more slides. All right, so this will be the last slide. So when you see a structure here, right, in histological sections of the kidney, for example, they call this as renal corpuscle, and it looked like blood. That's why it's called renal corpuscle. Corpuscle is kind of like red blood cell, but renal corpuscle is different. Is this? Renal corpuscle would have both. It would have the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus underneath. This is known as the renal corpuscle. But it only have like this. That's the Bowman's capsule, okay? And the glomerulus underneath. So together, it's known as renal corpuscle. Okay? So you can say, oh, here's a renal corpuscle. But you can see the renal corpuscle has the glomerulus inside and the Bowman's capsule on the outside. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I know you guys just have exam. You're tired.